Hello and welcome to A Journey into Grace. My name is Tim Cole.
I'm Jim Davis.
And we're delighted to have you join us again. We're in the middle of really kind of carving out the biblical context for the subject of grace. And for the last two sessions, we've been talking about the covenants. We started the biblical context talking about the consistency of the unwavering character and nature of God, that He never changes. And every spiritual truth is rooted in Him. So grace is rooted into the eternal, unchanging character and nature of God. And then we started talking about if God never changes, then what about the way He deals with man? And so we've been talking through the covenants and trying to address that issue. Has the way God has dealt with man changed?
Well, we didn't mention this before, but if God doesn't change, then He doesn't change how He deals with man. There has to be that, the consistency has to be throughout. So no, He doesn't change. He changes how He deals with man in certain ways, but the underlying truth is the same. Yeah. It is His relationship with man and man's response to that relationship that is consistent throughout. And the reason that it appears that God changes in His dealings with man is because the revelation that man has of God continues to grow and expand and enlarge. And out of that larger understanding of God, then God says, okay, now you know more. To whom much is given, much is required. Now that you know more about me, then your response to me should be fuller, broader than it was if you didn't know as much about me.
So, what I hear in that is that the covenants, as we're talking about, there's a progressive nature to the revelation of who God is, and that's why we see the specific workings of the covenants changing. But it's not because God has changed, nor is it because His basic parameters for how He relates to man and the relationship we can have with God has changed.
No.
So every one of these covenants have two basic components. In the natural, we've got the structure of the covenant, which is usually a law or some structure, and then there's the promise that comes out of the covenant. So far, we've dealt with Adam and Eve, the Adamic covenant. There was law in the garden, and there was a promise after they fell for redemption. We dealt with Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. There was a structure there, build an ark, do this for me. And then there was salvation. And the promise coming after that is I'll never destroy. Abraham, the same. We had structure. I want you to be circumcised. But even through the structure, even when he cut covenant, he can only do part of it. The halves of the animals were laid in half. And then he was put to sleep, and God the Father and God the Son made covenant with each other on behalf of Abraham. So each of those covenants, and all of the covenants there are 7 of them. 6 of them are relational covenants, we should say. 6 of them are relational covenants. Those are the ones we're going to touch on. The 7th covenant is the Palestinian or the land covenant, and that's not really a relational covenant. That's a covenant God made with the land. So we'll not deal with it because what we're talking about really is the relational aspect of the covenants. So in the physical realm, there are 2 parts, the structure and then the promise. But what you were talking about is that relational component underneath has always stayed the same. And it's, to use Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, as kind of the criteria. It's always faith, by grace, through faith. He's always related to man and required. That's the only requirement for relationship. It's faith that can only operate by His extension of grace.
Trust that I am who I say I am.
So He's always moving toward us. It's just who He is. He's always gracious. He's always loving. He's loved us with an everlasting love. But our response to that grace, in order to have relationship with God, needs to be faith. So every one of these covenants demonstrates that. So today we want to kind of wrap up the covenants before the new covenant. Of course, we're ending with the new covenant, and there's a progressive revelation to get mankind in general ready to receive the Messiah, to receive the answer. Up until then, there were structures and promises, but none of them, the blood of bulls and goats, couldn't save us from our sin. They couldn't wash away our sin. So they were promissory notes, if you will. They were stepping stones in the progressive revelation in the mind of man who God is, to get us to believe that He would be good enough to give us His Son.
Ooh. That's a big step.
And we'll see that Israel had some difficulty with that, and there are reasons for that. So we're going to spend 2 sessions just on the Old Covenant law itself. But for the sake of our discussion today, let's talk about the remaining two relational covenants in the Old Testament, which would be the Mosaic covenant, which is through which we get the law, and then the Davidic covenant. So let's start with the Mosaic covenant, and let's build in a little bit of that framework.
For me, and I know the same is true of you, that when I look at the underpinning or the motivation, if you will, for the Mosaic covenant, or the result of the Mosaic covenant, which was people coming to Mount Sinai, God delivering them out of bondage, bringing them through the desert, Passover, all of those kinds of things, and God again revealing to him, showing them his how the power of being under the blood saved them from the death angel. All of those wonderful pictures, and then he takes them out in the desert, separating them from the place of bondage, putting that behind them, taking them across being baptized in the Jordan, if you will, taking them across that.
Through the Red Sea.
Through the Red Sea. And bring them on the other side and said, okay, over here, I'm going to reveal myself to you. Over here, we're going to get to know each other again. And the just heartbreaking thing was that when people began to see a greater revelation of God, the power, the wonder, the awe of the mountain smoking with fire and thunder and lightning and all of those kinds of things, the response to that was, instead of being awed by it, becoming afraid of God. Because again, it's about relationship.
Mistrust.
They didn't have sufficient relationship, so they mistrusted God. He brought us out here to kill us. That was one of the accusations.
Wow.
He brought us out here to starve us. He brought us out here to kill us. He brought us out here to turn us back over to the Egyptians. And so when Moses went up on the mountain and met with God and came back down, the first interchange there was him saying, okay, God's got some things that he wants you to know. And the people's response, and again, to me, this is so heartbreakingly tragic. Wow. They said, we don't want to hear. You tell us what he wants and we'll do it. We don't want the relationship. We want just the push, pull, click, click. We want just tell us what to do and we'll do it.
So just to be clear, they said to Moses, we don't want to hear God tell us this. We don't want the face-to-face relationship.
Right.
We don't want the personal relationship. We want you to go listen for us and tell us what he says. And we're confident that if we know right and wrong, let's see, what tree is that again? It
tree
goes
of
back
good
to
and
the
evil,
Adamic covenant and what went wrong there. We chose a framework and a structure as our form of relationship with God. And that's been the problem with man all through all these covenants. But they said, we want the structure and we'll trust ourselves to perform it. And if we did, the resulting conclusion in their minds were, then they could leverage God to give them what he promised through the covenant by their own actions.
And it gave them an intermediary between them and God so that they could blame the intermediary if things didn't go well. Wow. You didn't tell us correctly. You didn't give us all the information. Something. So again, absolving ourselves of any guilt or responsibility or anything like that. It's all God did it wrong, or the intermediary dispensed the information wrongly.
Now, it may sound like we're being very quick to judge Israel. I just want to back up and say that's not the case at all, because the reality is hindsight is always 20/20. We can look back from our standpoint, covered under the blood of Jesus, and go, what were you thinking? But if we were all honest with ourselves, believers, to a man or woman, would have to admit that somewhere along our journme we've committed the same fouls.
Exact same thing.
We've withdrawn from God because we didn't trust him, and we've found comfort or solace in the structure of evangelical Christianity, or what that looks like in your local church. If I do this, I'm accepted, I'm okay. But that's being far. Jesus said of Israel, their lips are close to me. They know how to say the right things because they've embraced the structure, but their hearts are
far from me.
Are far from me. And God's always been about our heart. So again, kind of looking at that covenant, where's grace in that? So we've been building the context that the relational criteria has been the same. Faith that comes through grace. So where's grace in that?
Well, the beginning of them being brought out of Egypt, God coming to them, sending Moses to them, sending a leader to them to lead them out, a savior,
Yes.
if you will, to lead them out. So that's grace. They were doing nothing to deserve it. God sent them. God delivered them. God brought them, parted the waters,
Yeah.
brought them over to the other side. All of
Oh,
that,
we're hungry.
God fed them.
Oh, we don't have
Sent them
anything to
out.
drink.
Water out of the rock. Everything was God extending himself toward them, and all they did in between those revelations of power, murmur and complain, murmur and complain, murmur and complain.
Yeah.
We're going too long between meals. I'm getting too thirsty before my next drink. Something
So
was
in
wrong.
the face, after he delivered them, in the face of all of his demonstration of his care for them and supernatural ability to care for them, their response was negative, and they still didn't believe God to be who he said he was. And even in that unbelieving state, I think the ultimate sign of grace, a form of grace that's represented to me in the Mosaic covenant, was that he still invited them all up to the mountain.
All right.
Right? It's like these people were rejecting him at every turn. It's like they only wanted to be saved for selfish reasons. Like, I want out of Egypt just so I don't have to, but they didn't want relationship with God. And the ultimate demonstration of grace to me is that God offered to everyone the ability to come to see him, thunder and lightning on the mountain. There was a perimeter
and
set.
hear
They all
him.
couldn't go all up to the holy place, or to the place where he was literally on top of the mountain. So there was a perimeter, but he invited everyone up to see him in that way. And he wanted everyone to hear him. But they rejected him. But that's the element to me. It's the kind of the ultimate demonstration of grace in the Mosaic covenant. And it's what we see replicated as well in the New Covenant. Everyone. For God so loved the world that he gave his son. This invitation.
The grace of God has appeared to all men.
And it's really the proof of real grace. There's no merit, right? We didn't love him first. He demonstrates his love to us in that while we were still sinners, apart from him, unbelieving, he gave himself. And that's demonstrated here in this covenant. So we know that the Mosaic covenant is largely wrapped up and defined by the law. And we're gonna dedicate 2 more sessions in the future as we talk about the ramifications of the law and what God intended for us to get out of the law, and then secondly, our response. So we'll set that aside for the moment as we kind of wrap up the discussion of covenants. So let's talk for just a moment about the Davidic covenant. What was going on with David and his covenant with God?
David was ahead of his time. David operated toward God, and his relationship with God had marks of new covenant in it. They had under the law, they had the priesthood, they had the temple or the ark, had all of those things, had the barriers between man and the presence of God.
Right.
Only a priest could go in, and into the Holy of Holies, priests could only go in once a year, and then under very severe punishment if he did it wrongly, very clear criteria of all the little steps that they had to go through. And come to David, and David, when he brought the ark back, pulled back the curtains and met God face to face.
So just pause right there for a minute. Let's just crystallize this for a moment. What we're talking about is because of the fall of man, there's a twist in us. When Adam and Eve chose the wrong tree, they chose structure in place of personal relationship.
Right.
And because they didn't trust God, they lost faith in God. God's always been about faith. He's looking for faith, and that's the criteria for relationship. So we get to David, and we get twisted in the law, and we think that somehow the law was given for reasons it wasn't. And so we gravitate to it, and we embrace it, and we think it's what's going to save us. If the law were so important, then why did God give David a special dispensation to break the law? Because he was still under the law. I mean, I think that thought, and I go, there's no real good answer other than grace. God was never about trying to force man to follow the law so that he could use it as a prerequisite for a relationship with him. That's not the purpose of the law.
Exactly. When he was running from Saul, he ate food that under the law you could die for eating because only the priest could eat of it. That face-to-face encounter with God behind the veil, again.
So it's like you said, he was a man really before his time, really out of context.
Right.
The context was the Old Covenant law, but God allowed him to live in such a way. I love it when he brought the ark out. So as we're talking about the structure, there was structure to the Davidic covenant, and there was a promise to that his throne would always be filled, that there would always be someone on the throne of David. Thank you, Jesus, that
Yes.
you are the king
That's on the throne.
of the tribe and lineage of David. So David's heart, I love this. David was a man after God's own heart. And what made him a man after God's own? In your opinion, what made him? Was it the law? Was it what he did?
No, it was just the opposite of that. That his relationship with God was not built on what the law demanded. His relationship with God was based on his relationship with God and him continually falling on the mercy of God, knowing that he had sinned, knowing that he had done wrong, and knowing that he deserved death because of it. But yet just falling on his face before the Lord and there finding mercy and grace in his time of need.
So I love the picture that creates for us, particularly as we get a glimpse through the Psalms, that when David was in trouble, even when it was his own fault, like sin, when he recognized the sin of his own life, it grieved him, but the evidence of the underpinning of relationship wasn't in the structure of the promise. The evidence that it was based in his faith and his real belief about who God really was is that he ran toward God.
Just the opposite of what Adam and Eve did.
They ran away from God, and he ran toward God. Said, Lord, have mercy on me. Purge me with hyssop. Do what you got to do, but cleanse my heart. Create in me a clean heart, because I'm as the deer pants for the water brook, so my soul pants for you.
Restore unto me the joy of my salvation.
Yeah, but what was the joy of his salvation? Was it the law? Was it this framework?
Yeah.
No, it was this relationship with his Father, and that's what we've been kind of focusing on in the discussion of the biblical context of grace and the covenants, that the nature and character of God has never changed. He's the same. And neither has the way he's related to man. And as we fast forward, we're going to deal, before we get to the new covenant, we're going to pause and deal with the law itself, because that's such a stumbling block to a lot of people, believers and unbelievers alike. We're going to deal with the law, what it was intended for, and then how we misused it. And then we're going to spend a couple sessions on the new covenant and really talk about grace defined through the lens of the new covenant. But all of these covenants were different in their structure and their promises. They were used by God to progressively give more revelation of who he was, so that when we got to the new covenant, we would be capable of accepting the real answer, which is, and the lavish, scandalous love that provided it.
Hallelujah.
That he would love us so much that he'd give his only son.
He's a good God.
He's such a good God. I want to thank you for
stick with him.
Want to thank you for joining us. It went a little bit longer today. We wanted to finish the covenants. We appreciate your journey as well into grace. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, email us at grace@destinycc.net. Again, that's grace@destinycc.net.
God bless you as you continue your journey into grace.